I can remember the day that I chose my grade 10 subjects like it was yesterday. I remember taking out the subject choice form and reading through it and then turning it over and hoping there was more options on the backside. Disappointed that there's not. And I couldn't help but notice double PE wasn't a subject choice that I could take. Neither was beach studies. Neither was bush studies. And I was left thinking, is this going to be my life? This is my choice. And a little bit of me died that day. But something else happened. I actually grew up a little bit that day when I realized sometimes your only choices are bad, but you still have to choose. On Wednesday, we vote. And sometimes your only choices are bad, and you still have to choose. That's just, I'm just trying to disarm you a little bit before I speak on politics. Because we live in a country, but also in a time globally where the political climate is hotter and more binary than it's ever been. There are 72 countries this year holding general elections, and at no time in history has there been a more divided, more hot, more binary political climate than right now. This is a critical juncture in the history of the world. In a comprehensive survey done in the US in 2021, 36% of Republicans and 33% of Democrats believe that they feel justified to use violence to advance their political goals. The last time that survey was done was 2017, and that number was at 8% for both of them. So between 2017 and 21, they went from 8 to 33 and 36. If it was to be done today, I would guess that number has not gone down. That number has only gone up. Friends, our beliefs are important, but our character is far more important. Our character is how our beliefs cause us to live. In this current example, it's how our beliefs cause us to treat people that we perceive as our enemies. These aren't even people who are our actual enemies, but they're only people that we perceive to be our enemies. I don't understand how we have allowed politics to become the dividing line between enemy and friend, between truth and error, and between good and evil. Somehow, all over the world, we have allowed politics to become that line between good and evil, friend and enemy, truth and error. Politics, how is that the line? Let's, for the sake of arguments, say that the people that are on the other side of the political divide from us are in fact our enemies. They're not, but for the sake of argument, let's just say today that they are our enemies. How does Jesus instruct us to treat our enemies? Excuse me. Matthew chapter 5, he says in verse 44, "Love your enemies, pray for those who persecute you, that you may be children of your Father in heaven." Love your enemies and pray for those who persecute you, that you may be children of your Father in heaven. If you want to be children of your Father in heaven, the instruction, not the suggestion, the instruction from Jesus is, if you want to be children of your Father in heaven, love your enemies. Pray for those who persecute you. He causes the sun to rise on the evil and the good. He sends rain on the righteous and the unrighteous. The key in this verse is love. How do your beliefs cause you to treat those that you perceive as your enemies? Rich spoke last week on Pentecost, and he was saying so beautifully that Christianity is not about how much information about Jesus, how much information about God can I cram into my mind. It's how much of Jesus can I get into my heart? How much of the power of God can I get into my heart so that it can cause me to change how I live my life? See, my beliefs don't change me. My actions are what change me. You don't judge me on my beliefs, you judge me on my behavior. I can say, I believe that it's wrong to murder somebody, but if I stab someone and they die, I'm still a murderer because my actions are what you judge me on, not my beliefs or my intent. And so Christianity is not about, I've got a good theory and a good understanding of God, I know what He's like. No. I know how to live. I have the power of God in my heart because of what He's done for me. It's no good for us to be criticizing people that we haven't prayed for. It's no good for us to be speaking politics more than we speak prayers. And it's no good for us to view people who differ from us as enemies. A man called Richard Baxter says this: "They are dangerously mistaken who think that Satan has but one way to man's damnation, There are many ways to hell. As Angus Young put it, there is a highway to hell. And there are as many ways to hell as there are to the extinguishing of love. The problem isn't that we disagree with people. The problem is that we don't love people. When our love is extinguished, what are we left with? When we don't love friends, brothers, sisters, followers of Christ, when we don't love, what do we have? And what are we? Are we followers of Christ if we do not love? Everybody's favorite wedding scripture, 1 Corinthians chapter 13. Says, if I speak in all the languages of earth and angels, but I don't love others, I would only be a noisy gong or a clanging cymbal. If I had the gift of prophecy, if I understood all of God's secret plans, if I possessed all knowledge, if I had such faith that I could move mountains, but I didn't love others, I would be nothing. If I gave everything I have to the poor, if I sacrificed my body, I could boast about it, but if I didn't love others, I would have gained nothing. Friends, Christians, do you love? Do you love people who campaign for other parties? Do you love people who lead other parties? Do you love people who vote differently than you? If you don't, Paul says, you have nothing and you gain nothing. A noisy gong, a clanging cymbal. And if you don't love, it's not your country that's in danger, it's your soul. Brothers and sisters, what I'm calling you today to is a life of love. This might seem a little bit of a strange turn to take in a sermon called Principled Voting. But if Christians ever speak on politics and we don't include our ethic of radical love, I think we've lost the plot completely. Of course we love our country. Of course we have a responsibility to vote and to see change and to see the marginalized cared for and society taken care of and services delivered and leaders held accountable and the economy flourishing and all those good things. But Paul says to the Corinthians, you can gain all of that, and if you have not love, you gain nothing. Jesus says, what would it profit a man if he gained the whole world, but yet forfeits his soul? If any of that takes place outside a life of radical love, might I suggest that that is a bigger problem than any political party currently on our scene. Politics at its best is a means by which society organizes themselves for the betterment of the people and the place. But politics must always take place in its correct context, pace, and place. We are not political beings who engage sometimes in spiritual activity. We are spiritual beings who sometimes engage in political activity. It's not wrong for Christians to be politicians. It's not wrong for Christians to belong to political parties and campaign for political parties. It's not wrong at all. Just as it's not wrong for Christians to be bankers and lawyers and accountants and plumbers and electricians. It's not wrong for Christians to do that. But if the banker, the lawyer, the accountant, the plumber, and the electrician don't have a radical ethic of love, they are then bankers who sometimes partake in spiritual activity. If politicians do not have a radical ethic of love, they are political beings who sometimes engage in spiritual activity. Friends, that is not what we are called to. We are spiritual beings who sometimes partake in political activity. We cannot change anything without first changing ourselves to love more. How do you love more? Is it a case of choosing to love? Sure. Is it a case of reminding yourself over and over again to love? Sure, it is that. Both of those are part of sustaining love. My wife has to wake up every morning and choose me. And then when I say or do certain things, she has to remind herself every day that she loves me. And she has to keep reminding herself why she loves me and why she married me in the first place. We've got to keep reminding ourselves. That is what it means to sustain love. But more than this, love is a fruit, according to Galatians chapter 5. It is a fruit is something that is produced in us when we live a life in unity with the Spirit. When we abide in Jesus, when we remain in, when we stay in Jesus, these are some of the fruits that are produced in our life. One of them is love. So how are you cultivating love in your life? The things that you watch, the things that you read and listen to, the activities that you're involved in, the people that you spend your time with, the places that you go to, do they cultivate the fruit of love in your life? Or do they cut off the fruit of love in your life? Of course, we can't bear fruit without remaining in Jesus. But again, what we're calling you to is we're not calling you to just abide in Jesus and become monks in monasteries and all we do is just sit cross-legged and abide in Jesus all day. No, we have work to do. We have things to do. So we want to abide in Jesus. And while we are doing work, the things that we do, the people that we're with, what we read, what we watch, what we listen to, where we go, everything that I put my hand to, every place I put my foot has to cultivate something in my life. The things that you do they cultivate love in your life? And to put it into today's context, does the way that you engage in politics and voting cultivate love in your life? Or does it cultivate hatred and discord and division and dissatisfaction and disunity? Unless the Lord builds the house, Psalm 127 says, the builders labor in vain. Unless the Lord watches over the city, the gods stand watch in vain. Unless the Lord watches over the city, the gods, those who are entrusted to care for the city, those who are looking out for its welfare and protection, unless the Lord watches over the city, those people stand watch in vain. Friends, if you are talking to politicians about the state of your country more than you are talking to God, then you are wasting your time. You are doing it in vain. We build and we guard in vain. It counts for nothing. Friends, if the fruit of your life is not radical love that has been cultivated over a long period of time, then the best that you can do is place your hope in politicians. And I can promise you, there's one money-back guarantee I can give you. Every single one of them will let you down. You know how I know that? Because they're human, and humans will let us down. I will let you down at some point. It's a guarantee. As will they. I trust that I'd let you down less than them, but I still might let you down. It's okay for you to have a little giggle at that if you'd like. There is a way, though, for us to put politics in its correct place, to vote with faith, conscience, and wisdom, and to live a life of love so that we can put our hope in the right place. We have to remember that there's no government that can bring order. There is no army that can bring peace. Order and peace are a consequence of mankind coming under the authority of the kingdom of heaven. If our hope is that the government would bring order, that the army will bring peace. Friends, our hope is not eternal enough. That is a temporal hope. There is no government that can bring order on earth. There is no army that can bring peace on earth. Order and peace are a consequence of the people on earth, all of creation, coming under the authority of the government of heaven. I love history. One of the reasons I love history is because it was a subject I chose on that limited choice of subjects that I had. But I also love history because I love the future. And the best predictor of the future is the past. Those that do not learn from the past are doomed to repeat it. Every single political system, every single political party and idea is temporal. The best party ever could win these elections, and in a generation or two, let's say it's 10 generations. For the sake of argument, let's say it's 20 generations. It will still come to pass. It will still end. Somebody else will take their place, and everything will just repeat itself all over again. This is the story of history. Every empire, every political system has done this. Kingdoms rise, kingdoms fall. Empires rise, empires fall. Kings rise, kings fall. Rulers, this is the story of history. Even democracy. Friends, democracy is an okay political system, but crumbs, it has its shortfalls. South Africans were told that their hope was in democracy after hundreds of years of oppression, that our hope was in democracy. And we are sadly working out that democracy is quite an empty thing to place your hope in because it's temporal. It will pass. It will change. Something else and somebody else will take its place. It is temporal. The Greek philosopher by the name of Plato called democracy the tyranny of the majority. Mark Twain, who was a thinker, said that democracy is the only system in the world in which two fools outvote one genius. And here is the main problem with democracy. All of us are surrounded by fools because we're surrounded by each other. Me in particular. Friends, our hope has to be in far more than democracy. Our hope has to be in far more than politics. It has to be something more permanent than that. Our hope is eternal. So when we forget this, we tend to get caught up in small fights and that end up deeply dividing us. Friends, politics is a small fight. Politics is a very small fight. The big fights are how do we save a man's soul? Not only his soul, but how do we save his family and his marriage and his business and his relationships and his finance and his character? How do we get him to not only have Christian knowledge, but to have the power of Christ living in his heart? How do we get a human to cultivate the earth and steward everything around them for the kingdom of heaven, to pull the kingdom of earth, the kingdom of heaven onto earth and establish it here? These are big fights. Rescuing people from the kingdom of darkness into the kingdom of light. Rescuing people from death to life. Friends, those are the big fights. Politics is a small fight. I'm convinced that Christians should be engaged in politics, but not fighting about it. When we fight the small fights, we lose the big battles. When we neglect the big fights, when we neglect to fight and take part in the big battles, we end up fighting in the small fights. And they become the big thing, and we use the small fights to divide us. Friends, there's a better way. I promise you there's a better way. We can disagree. We can make our case, and we can reason with one another. Absolutely. But if our political engagement leads us to lose our life and witness of love, or if it causes us to view others as enemies, if it leads to fights, we've placed politics in its wrong place. We've made the small fight into the big battle. Politics, friends, is a small fight. Paul writes a letter to Timothy in 1 Timothy chapter 6. He speaks about people. He says they have an unhealthy interest in controversies and quarrels about words that result in envy, strife, malicious talk, evil suspicions, and constant friction between people of a corrupt mind who've been robbed of the truth and who think that godliness is a means to financial gain. In verse 20, he says, guard what has been entrusted to your care. Turn away from godless chatter and the opposing ideas of what is falsely called knowledge, which some have professed, and in doing so, they've departed the faith. He says they've been caught up in these arguments about words that lead nowhere, and they've made the small fights into the big battles. And when we make the small fights big battles, he says, some have depart from the faith. People lose their salvation when we make the small fights into big battles. Friends, politics is a small fight. Paul writes 2 letters to Timothy, who's a young man who leads a church. And in those 2 letters alone, there are 7 warnings to Timothy. Something was going on in the churches Timothy was responsible for. Something was going on. I don't know if, whatever it was. A lot of the principles, though, can be applied to our political climate. I remember the first time that I saw an April Fool's headline. I recently got my license. I was driving through town. There was a headline on a lamppost. David Beckham signs for Kaizer Chiefs. I didn't really care about soccer, so it didn't really interest me. But for 15 minutes, I can remember driving along, thinking to myself, what? How did this? What? I wonder how this took place. And I started picturing the scenario, like, whose agent phoned who? How did the conversation go down? Like, I was confused for a solid 15 minutes. And then I saw another headline, and the next headline said, Durban is going to import white sand for its beaches. And I thought, the second one got me. It's April. For 15 minutes, they got me. It's April Fool's. Well done, they got me. The next year, April Fool's, I can't remember what the headline was. I saw the headline. As I read it, I thought to myself, what? April Fool's. It got me, but it only got me for a couple of seconds. The next year, I was ready. I knew April Fool's was coming. I prepared my heart for April Fool's, to receive April Fool's. The headline didn't get me, and I was quite proud of myself. My question to all of us is this, friends. How come April 1st is the only day that we critically evaluate our news and information sources? If a political party put out a post on April 1st, we would laugh about it. But if they put out exactly the same post on April 2nd, we would swallow it and digest it and then disseminate it to others. Take it as the truth. How? And this goes beyond politics. It goes far beyond politics too. Friends, I want to encourage you, don't mix in spiritual gullibility with your spiritual formation. Jesus calls us, he says, if you want to come to me, you must become like a child. But he calls us to become childlike, but he doesn't call us to become gullible. In fact, he reprimands the Pharisees for causing little ones to stumble. He says it's better for you, if you cause little ones to stumble, it's better for you that a millstone is tied around your neck and you are thrown into the ocean than to cause a little one to stumble. Take a moment to pause. Think about some of the stories that you have shared. Think about some of the posts that you have forwarded on. Think about some of the conversations where you have told people the truth about what's going on around a bra. Has it caused others to stumble? Was it true? What kind of fruit did it cultivate in your life and theirs? Friends, this is about politics, but it's more than politics. When you send something, when you send a link, when you forward a WhatsApp, when you forward a video, when you DM somebody, a story, whatever, you're not just sending them information, you're actually sending a little bit of your reputation. Some of us have to guard our reputations a bit better with what we send and share to others. We have to guard our reputations a lot better. Critically evaluate, friends, please. Critically evaluate what you read and hear, especially when it comes to politics. Don't go to political parties for truth. We have a source of truth, and it's not politicians. Don't go to political parties for hope. We have a source of hope, and it's not political parties. There is no army that can bring peace, no government that can bring order. Unless the Lord builds the house and watches over the city, the laborers and the guards labor in vain. And so today is not only about politics in general, but it's about voting in particular. So I'm going to ask us 3 questions, and then end. I'm going to do my best. You don't have to come up with a question. I've already come up with them. You don't have to come up with the answer. I'm going to do my best to answer them as biblically, faithfully as I am able to. And then we're going to be done. Number 1. Am I morally obliged to vote? Do I have an obligation morally to vote? A very short answer to a very complex question is yes. I'm convinced that we have an obligation to vote. The church throughout history has held different views on this. Martin Luther, who was a church reformer, held very strong convictions about the separation of church and state. In fact, he held such strong convictions that he believed that they should not involve themselves in each other's affairs. Church and state is separate. Don't even involve yourself in each other's affair. Marriage is a state issue. Politics, a state issue. The church mustn't involve themselves in such issues. I think his views were probably a little bit left of me. I don't necessarily agree with all of them, but the church has held differing views from this in the past. Robin Tooley, who is an apostolic partner of ours, did a phenomenal teaching 2 weeks ago on faith and politics. We sent out a condensed version on our Church Center app. If you didn't receive it, if you're not on our Church Center app, speak to somebody at the hospitality desk. I would encourage you. It is a condensed version of it. Go and listen to it. It is phenomenal. It is an outstanding exhortation of why we should vote and how we should vote. How should Christians engage in faith and politics? It is outstanding. If you don't have it, speak to somebody at the hospitality desk. If you do have it and you thought, it's somebody else, I would like to encourage you to go and listen to it. But I can condense it for you in one word. Yes. The word is yes. We have a moral obligation to vote. Of course, to pray, but I believe we have a moral obligation to vote. Also, James writes a letter to the church, and in it he says that faith without works is dead. So it's no good saying that you have faith that God will do something while you just sit there with your legs and your fingers crossed. I hope I've got faith, God will do it, while I just sit here and do nothing about it. No, you show your faith by what you do. My kids don't come through for breakfast to find me praying on my knees in the kitchen, and there's eggs and bread and hot water and a tea bag sitting there, and I'm praying, God, would you please give us eggy toast and tea for breakfast? Right? God has provided us with the food. I've got to do the work of making the breakfast. Better yet, they can do the work of making me breakfast. Unless it's coffee, I always make my own. But God, it's no good us just having faith, friends. We have to have work also. God has given us the tools by faith, by grace, as a gift. I didn't earn it, but I now have to do something with it. I show my faith by my works. I can't just pray for my country. I have to vote. My conviction. So God has provided us with governments, according to Colossians chapter 1. But then we can't just sit back and pray with our fingers crossed and hope that we'd all get breakfast. No, friends, we show our faith by our works. So that means we must vote, but it also means that you and I have a moral obligation to participate in social cohesion. We've been speaking for the last couple of weeks about cultivating and stewardship. And one of the ways that I cultivate and steward the earth is through my active participation. I don't cultivate and steward that which I'm sitting on my knees praying for. Of course, I must be on my knees praying for it, of course. But that's not how I cultivate and steward. That's just how I pray. I don't get breakfast by getting all the ingredients and putting them on the counter and praying. I get it by God giving me the ingredients, and then I go and make it. I do something with them. I don't just sit back and pray because I'm spiritual. I actually get involved because I'm spiritual. Matthew 25 is the parable of the talents. And if you don't know the story, I'm not going to go through the whole thing and read it. And if you don't know it, you are welcome to read it in Matthew chapter 25. But I'm often wondered why the third servant is called lazy. And why the third servant is called wicked. The first one is given 5 and he returns 10 talents. The second is given 2 and he returns 4 talents. The third one is given 1 and he returns 1. And then the master, who is a picture of Jesus, calls him 2 things. He calls him lazy and wicked. He has a 0 loss. He was given 1 and he returned 1. I lost 0. And yet he's still called wicked and lazy. I can understand the lazy part given the context of the parable, but the wicked part I haven't really understood. We spent a few days this week at a leadership conference in Joburg with a man called Mark Varghese, and he taught out of this passage. And his take on it was that the servant was considered wicked because his laziness robbed the people around them of his talents and what his talents could have produced. So he was lazy, but he was also wicked because his laziness caused the community around him to be robbed of what his talent should have produced. So when I pray but don't work hard with what God has put in my hands, it seems that Jesus calls me lazy, but not only lazy, wicked, because the earth around me doesn't get stewarded and cultivated with what he's given me to steward and cultivate it with. So this isn't, you can't complain if you don't vote. This is a little bit more than that. I'm convinced that we are morally obliged to vote, but more than that, I'm convinced that we are morally obliged to actively participate in social cohesion and cultivating the environment, the atmosphere, and the people around us to produce good fruit so that creation can be stewarded well. Number 2, is there such a thing as a lesser evil? And when it comes to voting, is it just that I have to choose my vote based on who is the least bad? Right? That's how many of us approach politics. Okay, there's 20 of them. The question is not who's the best. The question is who's the least bad on many of our minds, right? It's just me. I know it's not just me because I've spoken to some of you. So is there such a thing as a lesser evil? This question is a bit nuanced. So Rob spoke to us, and in that message that you need to go and listen to, he encouraged us to evaluate political parties on 7 criteria. He says you should be holding political parties, their manifestos, what they say they believe, and their practice, how they actually do things. You should be evaluating them according to 7 criteria, 7 questions. Spiritually, morally, socially, economically, politically, developmentally, and ecologically. He says the spiritual question that you should be asking is, do they allow freedom of worship? Not only does their manifesto, does their stated belief allow freedom of worship, is their practice. When they are in power anywhere, do they actively promote and allow freedom of worship? The moral question is, do they advocate for the right to life, for human dignity, and for the common good? Again, not do they believe in that, do they advocate for it? Is it their practice? So we don't judge a Christian by what he believes, we judge a Christian by what he does. So politicians are the same. We don't just, not by what they say, not by what they believe according to their manifestos. It must be there, but it must also be in practice, how they live, right? I can't say I believe murder is bad, but I stab people on the weekend. No, it's got to be both. Socially, do they promote the interaction of all people, races, and cultures in theory and in practice? Economically, do they advocate for the right to be productive or for livelihood security? Politically, are they committed to good governance, and do they promote the shalom, the sense of well-being, of peace and prosperity of the country, the whole country? Developmentally, what do they believe and practice with regards to education and vocational training And ecologically, do they promote environmentally healthy practices? This is not my clever thoughts. It's straight from the mind of Robin Tooley. He can say it a whole lot better than me. Please go and listen to the teaching. These are the questions that we need to be asking all of our political parties and their manifestos. But here's the problem. The answer does not lie in the system. It lies in the people who implement the system. You can take the best people, the best system, and you put weak people in it, it will collapse. It is better to have a weak system and strong people than a strong system and weak people. That's the story of Daniel in Babylon. That's the story of Joseph in Egypt. It's the story of Moses' mother, Jesus' parents. We have to remember that the church was birthed in a Middle East that was under Roman rule. Friends, in a functional democracy, we have to start holding not only political parties collectively responsible, but also individuals who are called to implement their policies. There's only one party on the ballot whose policies line up fully with the Christian ideal of life. And so the question is, do we vote for a moral party that has very little say in governance, or do we have to choose the lesser of nine other evils? I would argue that from Scripture, anything that is not done in faith is a sin. But we also cannot choose sin in faith. So I can't commit adultery in faith. Just doing it in faith doesn't make it not sin. So I can't choose a sin in faith and then hope that it makes it less sinful. So our job then becomes to find a party whose policies answer our questions the best, who has individuals that can also implement those policies the best. If we believe that it is our moral duty to vote, it's also our theological duty to vote in faith. The only way that I can vote in faith is to not have faith in politics. The only way that I can vote in faith is to not have faith in politicians. If I have faith in God for the future of my family, my community, and my country, then I can very easily vote in faith in a temporal democratic system. It's very easy for me to do that. But if my faith is in politicians, I cannot vote in faith. Don't think too highly or too lowly of politics and voting. Don't place your hope in democracy. Don't place your hope in politicians. But also don't resign yourself to the fact that you have to vote for a party who you believe is inherently just less evil than the other four above them. We aren't asking the government to run the church. We are asking them to administer society. If the church is doing its job as it should, the values and practice of the Bible should always take precedence, no matter who's in charge. If the church is doing its job properly, whoever is in charge, the values and the principles of Scripture should be outworked in society. This is the story of the church in China, in Iran, in Palestine, in Saudi Arabia. This is the story of the black church in South Africa under apartheid. It's the story of Moses, Daniel, Joseph, Jesus, and Peter and Paul. The church should influence society regardless of the government who's in control. Friends, it's not the church's job to run society. It's the church's job to influence society. So I'm not calling all of us today to become politicians. I'm calling us to live a life of love as we steward and cultivate the society that God has placed us in. The church must always walk the line of holding government officials accountable, but of also not losing their focus from the big battles. We must hold government officials accountable, and we must also not be caught up into the small fights and we forget about the big battles. As the church is growing in Acts chapter 6, the apostles realize that there's too many issues for them to deal with, issues that are important and need to be dealt with, but they are still lesser issues. So they appoint deacons to do this work, men and women with delegated authority to steward the day-to-day workings of this new church society, community. Acts chapter 6 and verse 3, the apostles' instruction is, choose 7 men from among yourselves who are known to be full of the Spirit and wisdom, and we will turn over this responsibility of governing this new society to them. They can govern it, and we will give our attention to prayer, ministry, and the word. I think that we should view politicians not the same, but in a similar light to how we view deacons, according to Acts chapter 6. They are there to do the important work of administering society, while the church gets on with the urgent work of establishing the kingdom of heaven on earth. So, number 3, and I close with this, the question you've all been waiting for. Who then should I vote for? I can say this as my second money-back guarantee of the day. You are all going to be very disappointed in me because I'm not going to answer you. 2 Timothy chapter 2 says this, "No one serving as a soldier gets entangled in civilian affairs, but rather tries to please his commanding officer." I think that political parties and campaigning have absolutely no place from the church platform. We do not advertise banking institutions, insurance companies, supermarkets. We don't advertise any of them from the church platform. Why on earth would we advertise any political party from the platform? They have an equal part in stewarding society. If we do not advertise banks and insurance companies, we should not advertise political parties either. Remember, it's not the church's job to run society. It's their job to influence society. I will say this, though. I've chosen to vote for a party that I believe is the best chance of pairing good people with good policies to influence how national government is run. And then I've also chosen to vote for a party who has the best ability to influence, in my opinion, local and provincial government. And so I'm going to be voting for 2 separate parties on the national and provincial ballot. I think even that helps me to do it in faith, because I'm not a political being. I'm a spiritual being who wants to put politics into its rightful place and order. Please remember, friends, the ethic of our life has to be radical love. Please remember that our hope is not in democracy or politicians. Neither is our faith, but it is in something far more permanent than that. Please actively engage your faith in your community through the work of your hands and through working actively towards social cohesion. We've been closing every sermon for the last little while in a practice. And here's the practice that I'm calling you to this week. Please will you go on Wednesday and vote. And please will you go and vote in faith. We have to hold those in public office to a higher standard. I love it when sportsmen get caught doing something and they say, "I never asked to be in the public eye, I never asked to be a role model." Well, you did. We should hold politicians to a higher standard. A standard that humans deserve. Can you stand with me, please, friends?